Hey Nova Church, it's Matt, Katy, and Josh. Welcome to Midweek. We're so glad that you joined us tonight. And what we're going to do is we're going to record our weekly podcast called In the Margins. If you don't know what that is, In the Margins is part of the Nova Academy. It's a weekly show. We go through the book of Mark and we bring out a bunch of things in the text that we would want to go through on a Sunday, but we don't have time on a Sunday. So we're digging up the deeper things and giving us a lot to think about. And so part of that, we're going to record it. It's only going to be about 20 something minutes. And what we'd like you to do is listen and process it. But at the end of it, at the end of this whole video, there's an outro. So we're going to have a couple discussion questions for you to discuss in your house churches or family units, however you're going to do it. But we really want to encourage you to stick around afterwards to see those questions and then go and discuss it together. So we will see you after the show is over and with a couple discussion questions for you. Thanks so much for joining us. We wish we could be with you, but thanks again, and we'll catch you after In the Margins.
All right.
Love you, Nova.
Hey, before we get into the midweek lesson and In the Margins podcast, we have a few announcements that we'd like to share with you. So we've all been affected by the COVID-19 virus. And tomorrow, the entire ICOC will be having a day of prayer and fasting to really petition God to bring about resolution to this crisis, but also to protect, comfort the people that will be affected that don't have access to maybe some of the healthcare options that we in the first world have, but across the entire world. And if you'd like more information, there's a video that we'll put right here and that you can find more information about it. So please join us in that day of prayer and fasting for God to really work in this time of crisis and uncertainty. Moving on to some more happy news. This past weekend, Jacob Tevis and Haley Eskew got engaged, which is so amazing. We congratulate both Haley and Jacob, part of our awesome YoPro ministry. Congratulations to the Tevis family. Congratulations to the Eskew family. Both of their families are here, and we're so excited for you guys and glad to share in the joy of this time. Moving on. So the fact that the church has had to move online in a lot of ways has opened up new doors and exciting possibilities. This upcoming weekend, the ACR, the American Commonwealth Region, it's our family of churches here in Virginia and Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, Ohio. All of their campus ministries were supposed to have a campus retreat this weekend. Obviously couldn't do that. So they've made an online campus retreat. So that's where all these students will come together for a time of spiritual refreshment and enrichment. So please be praying for that. And lastly, the next exciting avenue is that there will be this Friday a national/international, depending on who comes, singles and young professionals Devo. That will be, we're expecting somewhere around 1,000 people, maybe more, to log in to our Singles Devo webinar. So please be praying for that. These really unprecedented, uncharted ideas that we really are praying that God works through. So that's the announcements for this week. And now I'll hand it back over to us for the rest of midweek and In the Margins. Hi, it's In the Margins with Matt Fisk, my wife Katy Fisk, and Josh Lund coming to us via his computer because we are in quarantine and trying to respect everything that's going on and
being obedient,
saving some lives and things like that. Josh, how you doing over there?
# stay home, brother. Stay alive.
Well, amen. Even though we may be bound up in our houses, but the word is not bound up. The word is not chained. And
come on.
Yeah. So anyway, She has to live with this all the time. Pray for Katy.
That was honestly painful.
It's the real reason I didn't travel over there.
Thank you for your honesty.
Hard not to take that personally. Okay. Well, to save me from myself.
That's right.
We're going to dive back into Mark. And last time we left off in Mark 4, where Jesus is doing all of his parable stuff. We got to some of the most familiar passages from the most familiar text in the whole Bible. And we found a lot of good stuff there. And then right here at the end, Jesus is going to go back into action mode. So we're gonna be doing Mark 4 verse 35 through 41.
That's right.
Is that right?
You got it.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's dive on in. Josh, you got us?
Yeah, let's do it. So like Matt said, we'll be in Mark chapter 4. We'll start in verse 35 and read to the end of the chapter. So here we go. This is the NIV. It says, that day when evening came, he said to his disciples, let us go over to the other side. Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? He got up, rebuked the wind and the waves. Quiet, be still. Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? They were terrified and asked each other, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him.
Yeah, I think this passage is just really appropriate for what our world is going through right now. And so I'm grateful that it's coming up now. But I know there's a lot deeper stuff with the text and the remezes that we're going to go over, but what really strikes me with this passage is the visuals, imagining what was going on here. And first of all, that they're going across to the other side, and we'll talk more about this being like the land of the Gentiles, which I kind of think of as like the land of the dragons. Like it's kind of like scary and eerie, like going over there. And then this huge storm comes up. And I just don't understand how Jesus was sleeping in the boat when it was swamped with water. So he's being soaked and he's being tossed violently back and forth. And he's hearing his disciples screaming, but somehow he's still asleep. Like, I don't understand that. I think that's amazing. But then just imagining him kind of getting up from his slumber and being like, shut up. And then everything just stops and goes calm. Like,
I did that this morning.
How crazy would that be if there was like this crazy thunderstorm going on outside our house and then Matt just goes out there and be like, shut up! And everything just clears.
I said that to my dog and it's not
really
fun.
Visually like incredible to me. So those are the things that stick out to me first.
Yeah. So for those of you that like haven't been listening with us, our podcast that we normally do, we spend a lot of time digging into the text and digging into these stories because there's so much more than usually meet the eye. There's the high level where there's a story going on, and Katy told it really well. This it's a movie. It's a comic book of it actually reminds me of the scene in Harry Potter in the 6th movie, The Half-Blood Prince, where Harry Potter and Dumbledore have to like cross this river or cross this like lake. And then there's like demons underneath, like in Fury, if you know the books. It's this like crazy boat ride from hell kind of deal.
Yeah.
And so that's one level. But the second level, which we're going to refer to as the remezes or remezine. So what they are, they're references to the Old Testament because the Bible was written by Jewish people who were steeped in the Old Testament lore. And so for them, some of this stuff is just so clear to them, but it aren't as clear to us as 21st century Americans who don't have their entire Old Testament memorized. And so from my study, in my opinion, I think there's a ton in here that's deeper than the story. Yeah. But so Josh, did you have anything you wanted to say before?
Well, I think similar to Katy, there's just a lot of things that as I read the story with this mindset of really wanting to go in the margins and get past just the what I've heard as a kid or what I read when I skim over this. There's a few things that stick out to me. But we can get to those when we get to them.
Yeah.
I'm excited about these remez that you have. Remezim.
Well, the very first one is the clearest one. Okay, so we've got, and even the if you've only been to Sunday school, even if you haven't, you should be able to pick this one out. Can you think of a story that has somebody on a boat, somebody sleeping on a cushion, and a storm that comes up in the Bible, in the Old Testament, anywhere? Can you think of one?
Jonah.
And the whale.
I mean,
don't forget the whale.
Well,
or fish.
Giant fish.
Yeah,
I mean, this is clearly Jonah. Literally, if you go back to Jonah 1, where within the first paragraph or two, it just says Jonah is running away from his mission to Nineveh and is sleeping in the guts of the boat on a cushion. And like that, it's the same story, like straight up.
Wow,
so
that's awesome.
All right. So why is that important? Well, think about for just a second. There's some things that we don't quite recognize geographically in the story. Okay. So where were they going? Where was Jesus in the boat? Where were him and his disciples going?
It's a great point. The other side there. I mean, they end up landing in a Gentile area.
Yep.
Right.
Near the Decapolis.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly where Jonah would have been going. Yeah,
we don't pick up on the geography of that so much, but they're pretty much going from the Bible Belt to Vegas.
Mm-hmm.
They are going from the Jewish people to the very not Jewish people, and so
the dragons.
So there's an interesting thing of you see the parallels already. All right, so if you think back to Jonah chapter 1, God tells Jonah to go where?
Nineveh.
And what kind of people are in Nineveh?
Ninevites.
Gentiles.
Yeah, Ninevites, Gentiles. And yeah, like super not Jewish people. But Jonah, does he want to go?
Nah, he ran away.
He runs away. He's like, I don't want to do this. Jesus, on the other hand, gets in the boat, and as he's on his way to the other side, what's his mindset?
He's asleep.
Well, he's asleep, but then I think you're missing the point, though.
Oh, he's excited. He's like, he's the one that's saying, "Let us go to the other side." Yeah.
He's the one that's
saying, calm too.
He's calm. He's resolved, and he's gonna go. And his mission is going to be to the Gentiles. And so, whereas Jonah runs away, Jesus is showing, and it's another thing.
He's leading the way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so it's the comparison there. You start to think of like, okay, got it. Jesus is the one he's going to the other side, and he is including people that other Jewish peoples, in fact, great prophets were running away from. And I think that's the first thing I get there. And I'm like, all right, so Jesus is resolutely going to the people that would have been excluded before.
That's amazing.
So I think that's a really cool point. That's the first thing that I start there, and I have to ask myself the question, the same thing where what we've been talking about, there's a theme going on of people that have been excluded from the kingdom and people have given up hope on. People will say, well, let's not go over there. Let's wait for them to come to us. Jesus is like, no, we're crossing over. And where other people run away, I'm going to. And I cannot wait. Join us next week. I cannot wait to talk about one of my favorite stories to talk about next week, Jesus and the demoniac.
Oh, I'm excited.
But that'll be great. But that's one part. So to start thinking through that of like, okay, thinking on that level, this is Jesus retelling the Jonah story in a good way.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
well. Following up with that is one of the first things that sticks out to me that's different than what I usually think of when I read this. When I read it, I usually think it's Jesus and the 12 in a boat, and it's them, and they're going to the other side, and it's just them. But Mark takes the time and he takes the ink to write that, it says, first of all, on that day when evening came, he said to them, and leaving the crowd, they took him. So it doesn't say just the 12, but it's this group of disciples that were listening to Jesus and asking questions even after the parables. But then it says verse 37, verse 36, and other boats were with him.
Yeah.
And so to me, it's, this isn't just a small little group, but there's a bunch of people that are around Jesus and following him, and just kind of seeing where things are going. But I think that applies to even the rest of the story. That it's a crowd of people that are kind of afraid and waiting for Jesus to take action. And yeah, I just thought that was interesting, because I always just picture this tiny little boat with 12 little guys, 13 including Jesus. But you've got a whole crusade. You've got a few boats traveling over there.
Sure. All right, you guys want to get into like the meat of this?
Ooh, yeah.
Like, what's the high point of this whole thing?
You shall not pass.
Oh, that's like my favorite part.
Yeah.
That's the Message version.
Nice. Yeah. So it's they wake him up, and just to set the scene a little bit, so that the way that the Jewish people viewed water, like the very first time that we encounter water in the Bible is in the first couple sentences where God is hovering over the water.
Yeah.
And so it's this idea of chaos, and Luke's version of this will literally call it the abyss. But Jewish people are not, they're desert people. They're not big water people. There's not a lot of great that happens there. So getting in the boat and going over, and there's a big storm that comes up. This wouldn't be seen as just like, oh, there's a storm that came up. This would have been viewed as kind of like demonic activity by most of them. So there's like this chaos and stuff like that. And the fact that Jesus gets up, they wake him up, and he goes out, and instead of offering up, you remember Jonah, they say, pray to your God, and then they chuck him over the side. Jesus doesn't pray, but instead he gets up and he does what? Shut up.
Yeah.
He literally, in Greek, it says he muzzles. Yeah. So what are you guys getting from that?
I just think that's such an amazing visual of Jesus muzzling the wind and the waves. And I think it's amazing because so far he's mostly been doing like quote unquote supernatural things, like, casting out demons and stuff. But here, the disciples' reaction, it says in verse 41, they were terrified and asked each other, who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him. So it's almost like he's taking it to the next level of, not only does he have supernatural powers, but he has power over the natural forces as well. And I don't think they'd ever seen something like that before.
Yeah, I just get this picture going back to the Jonah story of the men on the boat who run up to Jonah and are basically begging him, hey, what's going, like, pray to your God if you really think you're the one that's brought this upon us. And so it's the same with the disciples running up to Jesus and, hey, don't you care? Aren't you going to do something about this? And rather, like you said, Matt, than praying, Jesus himself is the one to calm the storm or to fix the situation. I mean, it's a clear connection to him and his divinity, I think.
Yeah. I think too, I mean, if the water represents, the abyss, then I think of, what is our abyss and how we have these deep seated fears. And I think we all end up crying out when our fears are triggered, Jesus, don't you care? Or God, don't you care? And it's like, we get the answer here. Like, he is Lord even over our deepest fears.
Yeah. Can I hit you guys with an Old Testament Ramez reference?
I suppose.
Hit me, man.
Okay. So Psalm 107, starting in verse 23. So this is where, like, because the result of all this, it's a reference, but then it gets to where even the disciples in the boat end up. Verse 23 of Psalm 107 says, some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the great waters. They saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep. For he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. Scooting down, verse 28, then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. It's kind of like, quiet, peace, be still, muzzled.
Muzzled, yeah.
Then they were glad that the waters were quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven. So that's Psalm 107. I think that's too much overlap for this to be a coincidence.
Yeah.
Like it just, to me, what this suggests is kind of like what we were talking about, but that they cry out to the Lord in trouble. This whole thing, I think, is you see the difference between Jesus being somebody who cries out to God for help and Jesus being God himself, that they saw him quiet the winds and the waves. And that's where they end up. Who is this man who commands the wind? He's the one that's muzzling them. I think they're starting to make a connection of like, this guy is not just a rabbi. Yeah. This mighty one is not just a prophet, because while we know the story that Jesus is the Son of God, they didn't yet. Yeah. Jesus was this rabbi, an amazing rabbi who did all sorts of crazy stuff. But this is where they go, uh-oh, like, who commands the wind and the waves? Well, they know their Bible. They probably know this. And they're like, who does it? But it's God. And in fact, it's only God. And so I think that's where we have to start connecting, or starting asking ourselves the question of, what is Jesus to me and what is Jesus in my life? Like, is Jesus the solution to my personal philosophical problems? Is he my daily inspiration? Or do I really believe that he has the power to command not just the winds and the waves, but even with what you were talking about, these insurmountable, supernatural and natural issues? Like right now, what a perfect time to talk about it in the middle of a pandemic. Yeah, right. Like, I don't know about you guys, but there have been times where I'm like, well, I've put more faith in the washing of my hands and the self-quarantine than I have of God can snap his fingers. God is the solution to this. Part of me goes, well, if the government would just do this, if we just had this stimulus package, or we just gave people this money, or gave people this time off, then maybe we could do something. And I mean, maybe, but it's God, you know?
One thing that I think really draws a connection between everything, we're talking about here, that I just think is super encouraging when you tie it with the divinity and all this, the power of Jesus and that he has, is, you think about the story of Jonah, and what aspect of God do we see in Jonah really more than we see almost anywhere else in the Bible? Well, at least in the Old Testament.
Like, what aspect of God do we see in the person of Jonah or in the story of Jonah?
In the story of Jonah.
Oh, okay. I think his grace and his compassion.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, not only for Jonah, but I mean, these are Ninevites, right? If you read the story of the Ninevites, they are worse than Nazis. And that's not, I'm not making that up. Like, they're really bad people. But then, you read Psalm 107, right? And I mean, it's a psalm of rescue. It's a psalm of, crying out and being heard. What I find so interesting about this is, what's the one part in the story that it makes sense to be afraid at?
The winds and the waves, the storm.
Yeah,
absolutely. And they're afraid. But once he calms them, he says, why are you so afraid? You still have no faith. And it says that they were terrified and asked each other. So there's not just fear before, but there's a fear after.
Yeah, that's true.
Down. This will play into what we talk about next week as well. If you think about it, when are the people most afraid? I'll give you a hint. It's not when they should have been afraid.
Right.
When they should have been calmed down. Yeah. But I just think there's this idea that, maybe we even do recognize the power of Jesus in things, but we recognize it coming from the wrong place. And it's a God of compassion. It's a God who gives chance after chance. It's a God who loves those who don't deserve to be loved.
What a great point.
We can respond with fear, but why are they afraid afterwards? They've just been rescued. They should be rejoicing. And I mean, sure, there's a level of, I think, fear and humility, at the feet of God, for sure. But I do think, even in this time, a lot of things to be afraid of, God shouldn't be one of them.
Yeah. What a great point. And even to connect, it's funny is that, where they're going in Psalm 107, it says that they were glad that the waters were quiet in verse 30, and he brought them to their desired haven. What's interesting about that is that he in Mark, Jesus calms the wind and the waves. He calls them to have faith and to recognize, like, hey, I've got some power here that you're not quite understanding. And then he's like, I'm going to bring you to the, if you're thinking Psalm 107, he's going to bring us to our desired haven. Maybe they were thinking, are you going to turn this boat back around so we go back home?
Right.
And yet he still goes across. And so your desired haven is actually to the Gentiles. It's another Jonah thing. It's like, we're going there. That's actually your desired haven. You don't realize it yet. And so then I have to ask the question is, when God takes the wheel, when God handles the problems, he's going to lead me somewhere, but it may not be where I want it to be.
Yeah.
Like it will be my desired haven, but I actually may not desire it in the moment.
Right.
Imagine that if the problems in my life, like if all these things go away, if Jesus takes the wheel and I really trust that he can deal with all this stuff, well, will I be okay with where it leads me? What if it's a place where I have to stretch myself to give more?
Yeah.
Even thinking through this situation right now, am I prepared to give to people? I'm actually, I'm an introvert, so I want to stay home. I don't want to give. But what if through all this, God is trying to bring me to a desired place, my desired haven to actually be more outward focused?
Yeah. I mean, I keep thinking about this whole concept of the abyss and how I think almost every person right now is struggling with this feeling of an abyss. Like, I mean, I'm just on the phone all day and everyone can feel the atmosphere of anxiety and stress and worry and fear and especially this looming abyss feeling of unfamiliarity, of uncertainty, like what's coming next. It's the unknown. And maybe our desired haven in this time is God actually bringing us all to deal with our own abysses, because if we were avoiding our fears before, we definitely can't do that now. And anxiety is definitely at its peak right now. Depression too.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I'll add on that, I mean, it's such a great point. And I haven't figured out quite how to say this, but it's something I've been feeling. And as I've been trying to keep up with the news, that I think I've been seeing is that in a similar way, right? It's like, dude, I want to go to the Gentiles. I certainly don't want to go there having to make my way through a storm, right? But it's this haven that they don't understand as a haven. And I think during this time, there's been so many just like radically good things that people have done to help the world. People, and there's a lot of messed up people who have taken advantage of it, but there's been a lot of things that I just think it's almost like God's trying to reset some hearts, and maybe there's a haven on the other side where people really start to wake up and realize that, hey, money's not everything. People taking pay cuts so that they can keep paying their workers throughout this time, or enemies of countries working with those countries to help in their hospitals. I mean, it's just incredible. There is a haven, and certainly when there's a God, there's a haven. But
it's almost,
I love that idea.
It's almost like, despite this pandemic, God is finding a way to bring more heaven to earth. Heaven and haven.
I like that. Well, it's like the kingdom has been bursting forth since this point, and up to this point, you could have seen it as like almost an ethical kingdom. Like, okay, here are the values, here's some parables and stuff like that. Jesus comes, here's the power. Like, it's not just even over demons. It's like over wind and the waves. Yeah. Oh man.
Which is interesting, because it's like our earth feels like it's on fire right now, but yet somehow the kingdom is spreading and the way of the kingdom is spreading.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
And even now, like that has to be part of what Jesus is trying to do. And even if Satan means this for evil, God means this for good. In what ways is God trying to bring heaven and the haven into a messed up world, even through the abyss? Oof, that's good. And then that's the faith that we need to have, that God is bursting forth to build his kingdom rather than just trying to mess up your life and your toilet paper situation.
TP, man.
Well, I think that's probably going to do it for us.
Yep.
Josh, anything else?
No. Thanks so much for joining us today, guys. This is, again, In the Margins.
Mm-hmm.
My name is Josh Lund. It's Matt Fisk and Katy Fisk. Thanks for joining us in our quarantine as we dive into the margins of the book of Mark. We look forward to seeing you guys, or at least talking to you guys next week.
Yeah, and if you want to check out more resources, the rest of the podcast, you can check us out at NVCA.academy or novachurch.academy. It's all there. Check out the deeper resources, other podcasts. You get all sorts of stuff, and we will check you next time.
Hey, Nova Church, thanks so much for joining us for In the Margins. I hope you guys got a lot out of it and your mind is teeming with things to share. So we got a couple questions for you tonight to discuss in your small groups for midweek.
Yeah, so one of the things that we talked about as we were going through the text was this clear connection that the story here in Mark 4 has with the story of Jonah, and specifically him on the ship falling asleep and, ultimately God calming the storm and saving the day. But we just want to encourage you guys as a house church to discuss the idea of what connections do you see between this story and Jesus and the story in the book of Jonah, and how does that one help us to understand a little bit better of the picture Mark is trying to paint, but also who is Jesus to us and what can we learn about him?
Amen.
Cool. And then to bring it to us to land the plane in the 21st century, the two-parter would be, how do you try to deal with, calm your own storms in your own life, trying to take the power away from Jesus? And then second to that second question is, how can you start to give him back control that only he can have and should have? So 2 questions. Jonah, how does this story connect to Jonah? What does that tell us about this story? And the second one, how do you take power back from Jesus? How do you give it back? So take that time. Please, please, please don't just watch this video. If you watched it by yourself, pick up the phone, get a Zoom call, do something to process together. And thanks again so much for joining us, and we will catch you later.
See you guys.
Bye.
All right.